Hello and welcome to Frank Philosophy, where we speak frankly about philosophy. I'm your host, Frank, a philosopher. I have a BA, an MPhil, and a PhD in philosophy, and I teach philosophy at a university far, far away. And today we'll be looking at one of the most important works in all of moral philosophy, The Groundwork for the Metaphysics of Morals by Immanuel Kant. This one's a doozy. This is tough. This is probably the toughest piece of writing that I've gone over on this channel so far. And it is so for a couple of reasons. Number one, Kant is really smart. He's a genius, plain and simple. And he's dealing with abstract and rigorous philosophy. He's pulling no punches. He's, Kant at his very best. This work is famous and famously difficult for a reason. It just talks about really abstract stuff at a really high level, and the arguments are tough to keep track of, and it's within the context of Kant's overall system, which is itself very complicated, and it's just tough. There's no way around it. I don't know if there is an easy way to explain what exactly Kant is trying to do in this work, but I'm going to try my best to explain it in a way that's a little clearer than you might get just from reading the text alone. That's one reason why it's so difficult. The other reason is that Kant is a terrible writer. Whatever he wrote down is what you get. He didn't have an editor, really. There wasn't a peer review process. It was just like Kant wrote down his thing and sent it off to a publisher, and that was it. You get what you get. And don't take my word for it. Leo Tolstoy also thought that Kant was a terrible writer, probably because he smoked so many cigarettes. And, the nicotine and all the cigarette smoking that Kant was doing probably made him think that his writing was really profound and interesting. And it was profound, but it was also manifestly unclear because, again, he didn't seem to have any editorial discretion about how to write clearly and well. So it's an uphill battle of trying to dissect Kant's writing, not only because it's super difficult, but also because it's not always clear. I'm not going to say too much by way of introduction of where the groundwork fits into Kant's overall system or give too much background. He kind of does this in the preface, which needs its own dissection because there's a lot built into the preface that's very complicated and needs decoding. That's what I'm here for. So Kant will explain how this is supposed to work in his system on his own. This is going to be part 1 of 3 of a series on the groundwork. We're going to do the preface and chapter 1 in this video. And then in another video, we're going to do chapter 2. And then in another video, we're going to do chapter 3. As you can see, we have a preface, chapter 1, 2, and 3. Okay. And again, this is the version prepared by Jonathan Bennett, which you can find on the Early Modern Text website, which has graciously given me permission to use these editions of the text for the purpose of these videos. So please do go and check out the Early Modern Text site to find your own version, your own copy of this version of the Groundworks. It's linked in the description below. Okay, without further ado, let's just get into it. This is a groundwork for the Metaphysics of Morals by Immanuel Kant, and here's the preface. Ancient Greek philosophy was divided into 3 branches of knowledge: natural science, ethics, and logic. This classification fits perfectly what it is meant to fit. The only improvement it needs is the supplying of the principle on which it is based. That will let us be sure that the classification does cover all the ground and will enable us to define the necessary subdivisions of the 3 broad kinds of knowledge. Okay, so he's starting off by, nice and modestly just classifying all knowledge into 3 different branches that follows the sort of classical Greek way of thinking about knowledge, right? We have natural science or physics, and this is the brackets are Jonathan Bennett's notes when something he feels needs explanation, which is a couple times per page. So natural science or physics. Natural science is a better way of grasping what the Greek physics was after rather than our contemporary notion of physics, which is much narrower. Ethics, which means what we think it does, and logic, which also is pretty straightforward. So not too much there. He's saying, okay, we got natural science, ethics, and logic, but we need a principle for why these are sufficient to capture all of knowledge that really matters to us in any way, and then we can figure out how it's further subdivided And the point of doing this is to figure out where morality fits in the grand scheme of things, where morality, as Kant understands it, fits in the grand scheme of things. It's within the realm of ethics, but it's something more specific, and Kant's going to show us why. There are two kinds of rational knowledge: material knowledge, which concerns some object, and formal knowledge, which pays no attention to differences between objects and is concerned only with the form of understanding and of reason, and with the universal rules of thinking. Formal philosophy is called logic. Material philosophy, having to do with definite objects and the laws that govern them, is divided into two parts, depending on whether the laws in question are laws of nature or laws of freedom. Knowledge of the laws of the former kind is called natural science, and knowledge of laws of the latter kind is called ethics. These two are also called theory of nature and theory of morals, respectively. Right? So he's taking the Greek division, right, natural science, ethics, and logic, and giving a principle based on a dualistic division between material knowledge and formal knowledge. So formal knowledge, right, that's logic. And material knowledge, which has to do with stuff, is going to be natural science and ethics, depending on whether it's dealing with laws of nature, right, which is the rules that govern the way that stuff works in the world, or laws of freedom, which have to do with the laws or rules that govern or should govern our decision-making processes. If that sounds abstract, don't worry, he explains a little bit more. Logic can't have anything empirical about it. It can't have a part in which the universal and necessary laws of thinking are derived from experience. If it did, it wouldn't be logic. In other words, a set of rules for the understanding or for reason, rules that are valid for all thinking and must be rigorously proved. Right? So he's saying that logic has to do with the way that thoughts and ideas and propositions are related to each other regardless of their content, right? So, for example, the law of non-contradiction, right? That any statement and its negation together always forms a contradiction. Doesn't matter what you're talking about, doesn't matter what context you're in, doesn't matter if you're talking about where to go to dinner or theoretical physics. It's always the case because of the rules of logic itself. It has no content. It's not about anything. Okay? That's logic. The natural and moral branches of knowledge, on the other hand, can each have an empirical part. Indeed, they must do so because each must discover the laws for its domain. For the former, these are laws of nature considered as something known through experience, and for the latter, they are the laws of the human will so far as it is affected by nature. The two sets of laws are nevertheless very different from one another. The laws of nature are laws according to which everything does happen, and the laws of morality are laws according to which everything ought to happen. They allow for conditions under which what ought to happen doesn't happen. Okay, so what's going on here? Well, again, he's doing this sort of deduction of the different kinds of knowledge and how we can approach different areas of knowledge in order to locate where his project is of trying to find the metaphysics of morals, or laying the groundwork for the metaphysics of morals, right? And he's saying that when it comes to, we're putting logic to the side, right? Logic is about things that don't have anything to do with experience. It's just like the forms of our thoughts and not any of their content. So that's out of the picture, okay? And then we have natural and moral branches of knowledge, morals being, the same as the Greek ethics, at least in terms of its nature. These two things are very different, as Kant will go on to say, but in terms of the fact that they both have an empirical content, right? They do have an empirical part. They must have an empirical part because they have to do with laws that govern the way that stuff functions, that stuff moves, right? So like laws of nature, for example, right? The fact that if you drop something, it will reach the ground at roughly 9.8 meters per second square. That's a law of nature, we might say. And Kant says that those are cool, those deal with nature, those are great. But we also have laws of morals, laws of freedom. And these are laws of the human will. So he uses freedom and the human will interchangeably. He doesn't give an account of the human will and freedom until chapter 3. And even there, it's like really tricky, but he's talking about, when we decide to do things, when we act in such a way, or when we make decisions voluntarily or through autonomy, right? When we act in a way that can or can't be morally worthy, those rules, he's talking about moral rules, right? When he's talking about laws of the human will, right? And he's just saying right now that those exist, right? And those are different from laws of nature because they can be broken, where laws of nature cannot be broken, right? Laws of nature are purely descriptive. They tell us how stuff actually works, whereas laws of morality just tell us how things should be, how we should use our will, our ability to make decisions. Even though sometimes, most of the time, we don't. Empirical philosophy is philosophy that is based on experience. Pure philosophy is philosophy that presents its doctrines solely on the basis of a priori principles. Pure philosophy can in turn be divided into two. When it is entirely formal, it is logic. When it is confined to definite objects of the understanding, it is metaphysics. Okay, so this is a tricky point, because now he's making a threefold distinction, right? So he's saying empirical philosophy is when we look out into the world and figure out how stuff works and come up with laws that, or regularities that describe the way that stuff works based on experience, right? But there's another kind of philosophy, and that's pure philosophy. And that's what Kant is really interested in, which is philosophy that's purely based on a priori principles, where a priori means having nothing to do with our actual experience, right? Now, when pure philosophy, a priori principles, is entirely formal, meaning it's not about any content whatsoever, it's logic, right? But there is empirical content in natural science and in ethics, obviously, because natural science is about stuff in the world and ethics is about how we interact with stuff in the world. But there can be a pure version of the study of that stuff, right? And the pure version of the study of domains of knowledge that have empirical content necessarily, the pure study of that stuff is metaphysics. That's what Kant means by metaphysics. So now he's located metaphysics, right, within the domain of, or the two domains of natural science and ethics or morality, right? Metaphysics is the pure philosophy of those two areas, which are essentially about stuff in the world, but we can study them from a perspective that doesn't care about that stuff, that doesn't have anything to do with any particular experience. And that's the pure philosophy that Kant is interested in. Okay, this will make a little more sense as we go on. In this way, there arises the idea of a twofold metaphysics, a metaphysics of nature and a metaphysics of morals. Physics, and this is, physics is natural science. I think that Jonathan Bennett just translated it as physics instead of natural science here. But this is natural science, right? Natural science, therefore, will have an empirical part and also a rational part, meaning the part that is of pure philosophy. And ethics, likewise, will also have that, right? Though here the empirical part may be called more specifically practical anthropology, and the rational part morals in the strict sense, okay? So there's going to be a metaphysics of nature, which is what he's done in the Critique of Pure Reason. I think he'll explain that in a bit. But there's also got to be a metaphysics of morals, meaning a way of doing pure philosophy that doesn't have anything to do with the particulars of the moral experience, right? With any particular situation, any particular virtue, any particular set of values, any details about your situation. There has to be a science of how morality works independent of all that stuff. And that is going to be the metaphysics of morals, and that's what Kant is interested in here. And to set that up, he goes on a rant here. So this is like a rant. This is another like tricky thing about Kant, which is like kind of frustrating to read. Like this is why I say he's not a good writer, because he doesn't give the appropriate amount of space to the most important ideas. He'll, pack so much stuff into into a few short paragraphs, and then he'll go on this rant, which, it does not need this much space, but he gives it that much space anyway. So so we can see this in action. Okay, so he's located where the metaphysics of morals is, and now he's going to make the case that somebody needs to take this project seriously. And he starts with an analogy. So here we go. All crafts, trades, and arts have profited from the division of labor. For when each worker sticks to one particular kind of work that needs to be handled differently from all the others, he can do it better and more easily than when one person does everything. Where work is not just differentiated and divided, where everyone is a jack of all trades, the crafts remain at an utterly primitive level. Now here is a question worth asking. Doesn't pure philosophy in each of its parts require a man who is particularly devoted to that part? Some people regularly mix up the empirical with the rational, suiting their mixture to the tastes of the public without actually knowing what its proportions are. They call themselves independent thinkers, and write off those who apply themselves exclusively to the rational part of philosophy as mere ponderers. Wouldn't things be improved for the learned profession as a whole if these independent thinkers were warned that they shouldn't carry on two employments at once, employments that need to be handled quite differently, perhaps requiring different special talents for each, because all you get when one person does several of them is bungling? But all I am asking is this: doesn't the nature of the science of philosophy require that we carefully separate its empirical part from its rational part? I'll stop there briefly. Right, so this is all just like a rant. So he's defending his project, because this is mature Kant. This is grumpy Kant. This is Kant who has like spent his whole life setting up his system. He has already published the Critique of Pure Reason, and it has already been replied to. He's very he feels very strongly about theory and the value of theory and the value of pure philosophy. And I guess a common reply that he would get is like, well, you're just doing all this theory stuff, but it doesn't actually connect to real experience. And Kant is sitting there saying it doesn't have to. I'm telling you what the rules are, right? I'm telling you like the background, like how stuff works without like in the most abstract and pure way that I possibly can. And that's why the world looks the way that it does to us. If you can't see that, you're just a dummy and you're just confusing stuff, right? So, this is grumpy Kant, and he's obviously not very happy with people who think that his focus on the pure or purely rational part of philosophy is misguided. Okay, so we'll go here again. But all I'm asking is this: doesn't the nature of the science of philosophy require that we carefully separate its empirical part from its rational part? That would involve putting 1. A metaphysic of nature before real empirical natural science, and 2. A metaphysic of morals before practical anthropology. Okay, so what's happening here is he's saying, he's again making the case for his project. That's what he's doing. And he's already done this part, right? The Critique of Pure Reason is him giving his metaphysics, his pure philosophy, as it has to do with the natural world. Right, that's when he gives his account of space and time and substance or matter, mass. I think causality is in there too, where he's giving the rules for how stuff works, for how our brains process things in the world, for how our concepts of things are formed, without actually going out into the field and doing tests and figuring out how stuff works. And he's saying that we have to do that, right? We need the foundation. We need the pure stuff before we can make sense of the stuff out there in the world. And he's saying that I need to do the same thing now for metaphysics or for moral philosophy, right? Before we can go out and make sense of like what is good, what is virtuous, what kind of life should we live? Should we Should I donate money to charity? Or what kind of person should I become, right? Before we start asking those questions, which he calls practical anthropology, we need to figure out just how morality works in the purest and most abstract sense, right? We just need to know, like, what are the rules? How is morality even possible? Like, how is this thing, morality, that we all seem to have some sense of, like, how does it come about, right? And Kant's answer is that it doesn't come about just by, like, chance and regularity. He thinks it's hardwired into the way that our minds, as rational, reasoning machines, are just, it's hardwired into there. And that's how morality is possible. Okay? And that's where this project is, right? Setting up a metaphysics of morals before we go and do the practical stuff, right? He's telling us how morality works at the conceptual level before we can go out in the world and, figure out what's the best sort of life to live. Each of these two branches of metaphysics must be carefully cleansed of everything empirical, so that we can know how much pure reason can achieve in each branch, and from what sources it creates its a priori teaching. Right? And he's doing, so this needs some unpacking. When he says, so that we can know how much pure reason can achieve in each branch, he's talking about, there is a limit to how much we can get from this metaphysic of morals methodology, right? When we lay the groundwork at the purely conceptual level without going into the field and consulting specific experiences about what we should do, there's a limit to how much stuff we can accomplish. And Kant wants to find those limits, right? He wants to do as much as he can to get as clear a picture as humanly possible of the pure essence, the conceptual machinery of morality without recourse to any specific experience. And there's going to be limits, right? We can't figure out everything just by pure theory. Obviously not. But we could achieve something, and we should find those limits. So we should set up a metaphysics of morals as best we can until we literally run out of things to do, and we have to go to experience to learn more about how best to act and things like that. But by understanding morality in its purest sense, abstracted from anything empirical, from anything that has to do with experience, we can still identify a priori teachings, meaning morality still has something to tell us by understanding its very nature, without interacting with or consulting anything in the world, any experience. So that's his claim, that this is going to work and this is worth doing. The metaphysics of morals must be cleansed in this way, no matter who the metaphysicians of morals are going to be. Whether they will include all the moralists, there are plenty of them, or a few who feel a calling to this task. Right? So Kant, the only times that Kant is like kind of witty and sassy is like with these little parenthetical I don't know what to call them, like interruptions. He just like interrupts himself with like some, sassy comment. Usually it's derogatory, and that's like, I don't know, worth a chuckle. I guess that's the only levity in here. Otherwise it's, again, a slog. Since my purpose here is directed to moral philosophy, I narrow the question I am asking down to this. Isn't it utterly necessary to construe a pure moral philosophy that is completely freed from everything that may be only empirical and thus belong to anthropology? That there must be such a philosophy is self-evident from the common idea of duty and moral laws. Okay, before we go to the argument, just to unpack this question again, right? He's saying, again, he's trying to locate the need and purpose of this investigation, which is to construct a pure moral philosophy that doesn't have anything to do with the particulars of any experience. And he's saying, don't we need to do this? Isn't this worth doing? And he's going to answer, yes, it is, and here's why. And he says, all we have to do is just look at what we mean when we say that something is a duty, or when we look at moral laws. Everybody knows what a moral law is in a rough sense. Because you know what a moral law is in a rough sense, and we all know what a duty and a moral law is in a rough sense, it follows that we need to examine these things in a universal context that is abstracted from the particulars of any situation. He's going to give this argument now. Everyone must admit that if a law is to hold morally, in other words, as a basis for someone's being obliged to do something, it must imply absolute necessity. That the command, "you are not to lie," doesn't apply only to human beings, as though it had no force for other rational beings, and similarly with all other moral laws properly so called. That the basis for obligation here mustn't be looked for in people's natures or their circumstances, but it must be found a priori, solely in the concept of pure reason, and that any precept resting on the principles of mere experience may be called a practical rule, but never a moral law. This last point holds even if there is something universal about the precept in question, and even if its empirical content is very small, perhaps bringing in only the motive involved. Okay, so what he's saying here is he's basically giving an account of what morality is supposed to be like, and he's appealing to common sense here. He's saying, like, look, when we say, like, if it's true that you should never tell a lie, right, that you're not supposed to lie, it's not just that, human beings aren't supposed to lie. It's that anything rational, meaning anything that's capable of lying, probably shouldn't lie in accordance with the rules of morality, the laws of the will, right? The laws of freedom, as Kant would say, right? And that obligation, right? To say that I'm obligated to do something, that's not a fact of, I'm not, the idea of obligation applies without any regard for the subject matter, right? It is a priori in the sense that, you could be obligated to do literally anything, right? The content of the obligation doesn't matter, right? If I'm obligated to, drive my mother to the hospital, I can be obligated to pick my kids up from school, I can be obligated to give money to charity, I can be obligated to tell the truth, right? Anything that has to do with any decision I can make, there is the possibility of being obligated to do that. And that doesn't matter, or that doesn't depend upon the content of any particular situation, right? The very idea of obligation is something that's a priori, right? It doesn't have to do with any particular situation at all. And that's what Kant is interested in when he's interested in morality as such, in its pure sense, right? How does that work? That's Kant's question. And then this distinction between a practical rule and a moral law, right? So we could say that there's practical rules, like, if you see an old lady, who's struggling to cross the street, or, put her bags into her car in the parking lot, it might be a good idea to help her out, or to help anyone out who is in need. Maybe that's, a practical rule, right? If you see someone in need, you should probably help them out, right? But that's not a moral law that you should always help those who need it. That's not what Kant means by morality. So again, how much you accept this already is a bit up for grabs. Kant thinks it's very obvious, but he doesn't argue for it here. He just sort of says it. He will motivate this a bit later. Thus, not only are moral laws, together with their principles, essentially different from all practical knowledge involving anything empirical, but all moral philosophy rests solely on its pure or non-empirical part. Its application to human beings doesn't depend on knowledge of any facts about them, which is anthropology. It gives them as rational beings a priori laws, ones that are valid whatever the empirical circumstances may be. Right? Again, so that's what Kant means by morality. So he's defining morality. He's saying, look, when we're talking about morality, the details don't matter. The situation doesn't matter. I'm asking, what are the laws that govern the way that we should be exercising our will whenever we're exercising our will, whenever we're deciding to do something, What are the rules that we should follow? We have a rough sense of these. They're called morality. But how does morality really work? That's the question, right? And it should work, it does work, in fact, no matter the circumstances, right? And that's what's so special about it. It seems tied to our rationality. And the question is how? How does that work? How do these two things come together? And Kant thinks the only way to figure that out is to do this a priori metaphysical method. And then, he admits, right, and this is, a long parenthetical, right? Admittedly, experience comes into the story in a certain way because these laws require a power of judgment that has to be sharpened by experience, right? So you need to experience stuff to learn how to use your power of judgment, partly in order to pick out the cases where the laws apply, and partly to let the laws get into the person's will and to stress that they are to be acted upon, right? So, teaching people stuff, teaching people how to be moral and how to apply the moral law. For a human being has so many preferences working on him that though he is quite capable of having the idea of practical, pure reason, he can't so easily bring himself to bear on the details of, to bring it to bear on the details of how he lives his life. He doesn't, pure practical reason, Kant means something unique and very specific by this, but he doesn't define it yet. Another thing, wouldn't it be nice if Kant defined all of his terms and then started working? No. You get what you get. A metaphysics of morals is therefore indispensable for two reasons. One theoretical and one practical. One reason comes from our wish, as theoreticians, to explore the source of the a priori practical principles that lie in our reason. The other reason is that until we have the guide and supreme norm for making correct moral judgments, morality itself will be subject to all kinds of corruption. So the theoretical reason is kind of like Kant's purely scientific curiosity, right? So Kant thinks that he fancies himself a scientist of reason, and that reason and the way that our minds work, in the sense of a science of how our minds work from the perspective of pure philosophy, not like empirical psychology, which he didn't think was the right way to go about doing things, in contrast to someone like David Hume, for example. And he thinks that, this is the only way to figure out what the practical principles that lie within reason, right, that lie within the faculty of reason, is to do this metaphysics of morals. And then there's the practical reason, which is that until we can figure out what the supreme norm for making correct moral judgments is, which is the categorical imperative, spoiler alert, right? This is Mr. Categorical Imperative himself, right? Until we know what that is, morality itself will be subject to all kinds of corruption. And here's why. Here's the reason for that. For something to be morally good, it isn't enough that it conforms to the moral law. It must be done because it conforms to the law. An action that isn't performed with that motive may happen to fit the moral law, but its conformity to the law will be chancy and unstable, and more often than not, the action won't be lawful at all. So we need to find the moral law in its purity and genuineness, this being what matters most in questions about conduct. And the only place to find it is in a philosophy that is itself pure, in the sense that I have introduced. So metaphysics must lead the way. Without it, there can't be any moral philosophy. Philosophy that isn't pure, in other words, that mixes pure principles with empirical ones, doesn't deserve the name of philosophy. For what distinguishes philosophy from intelligent common sense is precisely that the former treats as separate kinds of knowledge what the latter jumbles up together. Much less can it count as moral philosophy, since by this mixing of pure with empirical, it deprives morality of its purity and works against morality's own purposes. Okay, again, a little bit ranty, and a little bit repetitive, but sometimes, when Kant beats you over the head with his ideas, that's the only way that you get familiar with them. So again, right, you need pure philosophy, a pure metaphysics to identify, to solve this problem, really, right? To tell us why is it that we care about people's motives when they do things, and we're trying to decide whether what they do is morally good or not, right? So, you could help an old lady across the street because somebody tells you to, or because, if, maybe you went to a fortune teller and the fortune teller says, if you help the next person that you see, you'll find $100 on the ground or something, and you can go help the old lady across the street for that reason. And that's not morally creditworthy in Kant's sense. And we can all make that distinction, right? We can imagine doing the right thing for the wrong reason. And if we can do that, right, if we could just come up with that possibility, it's because there is a moral law that we know our conduct needs a different kind of relationship with, right? We need to do the right thing for the right reason. And Kant's interested, yes, like that right there, doing the right thing for the right reason and not for the wrong reason. Like that, right? That's where morality is, and we need to find that. We need to get there. We need to identify it. And the only way we can do that is by doing this metaphysical stuff. Otherwise, everything's going to be confused. I'm pointing to the need for an entirely new field of investigation to be opened up. You might think that there is nothing new about it because it is already present in the famous Wolff's, he's talking about Christian Wolff's, introduction to his moral philosophy. In other words, in what he called universal practical philosophy. But it isn't. Right? So Christian Wolff is a German philosopher guy, Kant's punching bag, basically, in a lot of his writings. Probably very smart, probably would be much more well-regarded if he didn't have Kant to contend with. He's got an SCP article, so, worth reading, I'm sure, perhaps, but Kant is not impressed by his work. Precisely because his work is aimed to be universal practical philosophy, it didn't deal with any particular kind of will, and attended only to will in general, and with such actions and conditions as that brings in, and so had no room for the notion of a will that is determined by a priori principles, with no empirical motives, which means that it had no place for anything to be called a pure will. So again, he's building on a theme here. This is, ranty, grumpy Kant, saying that, Wolff, when he was talking about moral philosophy, doesn't distinguish between, the pure will where morality is located and acting in a way that's generally morally okay that most people would agree to in certain situations, right? In a universal set of circumstances. That's not what Kant is interested in. Thus, Wolff's introduction concerns the actions and the conditions of the human will as such, for which the most part are drawn from empirical psychology, whereas the Metaphysics of Morals aims at a non-empirical investigation, namely investigating the ideas and principles of a possible pure will. Okay, so again, he's distinguishing his project from this guy Wolff's project, and he's saying that, I'm interested in the pure will abstracted from any particular empirical situation, right? Abstracted from whatever the details of our particular circumstances are. When that thing is at work, and when there's a duty to do anything, what the nature of duty itself, when that is working, that's moral philosophy, right? I'm interested in analyzing that stuff. And what Wolff is doing is talking about whenever we have particular duties and situations, and trying to generalize based on particular situations what the moral tendencies, I don't want to use the word laws, but what morality is like when we study actual human behavior. Kant is saying, I'm not interested in that. I'm interested in what is happening when morality makes a demand on us in the purest and most abstract sense. So without having the least right to do so, Wolff's universal practical philosophy does have things to say about laws and duty, but this doesn't conflict with what I have been saying. For the authors of this intellectual project remain true to their idea of it. In this part of its territory also, they don't distinguish motives that are presented completely a priori by reason alone and are thus moral in the proper sense of the word, from motives that involve empirical concepts, one that the understanding turns into universal concepts by comparing experience. Again, so like this is what Wolff is doing, right? He's saying, we see that, for example, people who are virtuous tend to have a higher quality of life or whatever, right? Like, so look at a bunch of behavior out in the world and try to identify regularities of how, people have certain moral qualities and how their lives tend to go or something like that, right? You can do that. That's anthropology. That's fine. You can do that, but don't call it moral philosophy, because this is moral philosophy. Moral philosophy is figuring out the laws of reason that govern how we should use the will purely by virtue of its properties, by virtue of the properties of the reasoning faculty itself. It is a priori. It is antecedent to any particular situation, and that's what makes it moral. In the absence of that distinction, they consider motives without regard to how they're different or to how their sources differ. They treat them as all being of the same kind and merely count them. And on that basis, they formulate their concept of obligation, so-called. This is as far from moral obligation as it could be. But in a philosophy that doesn't decide whether the origin of all possible practical concepts is a priori or a posteriori, what more could you expect? Right, so again, he's just casting lots of shade on poor Mr. Wolff here for not properly distinguishing between pure, true morality, a priori, which doesn't have any influence from any particular situation, and just like identifying regularities of behavior that we just so happen to deem as moral, and building our understanding of moral laws or obligation, quote unquote, in accordance with experience. Kant is saying that's no good. Intending someday to publish a Metaphysics of Morals, I now present this groundwork, this exercise of foundation laying for it. There is, to be sure, no other basis for such a metaphysics than a critical examination of pure practical reason, just as there is no other basis for metaphysics than the critical examination of pure speculative reason that I have already published. Again, this is Kant situating this project within the broader context of his other project, or of his whole philosophical system, after just having published the Critique of Pure Reason. So he published the Critique of Pure Reason, and that's where he does all the metaphysics for natural science stuff. That's where he talks about the categories. That's where he talks about, space and time and mass and causality and, laws of thought that process the way that that help to construct our conscious experience as such in accordance with laws, with just the way that our minds are constructed, right? So our minds are constructed in such a way to interpret the world in such a way that has a particular or definite shape or organization to it, and based on understanding that, we can understand the concepts that make up our conscious experience, including stuff like space, time, and causality. And these things are pure, right? So this is pure speculative reason because they don't have to do with any particular time, space, or matter, or causality. They don't have anything to do with the actual experiences out in the world. They are what Kant calls conditions for the possibility of understanding any experience. They are the shape of our minds within which all experience is supposed to be shaped or conform. That is right. So that's my attempt at sort of picking out what Kant is up to there in pure speculative reason, in the Critique of Pure Reason. And he's saying I have to do the same thing now for ethics, right? I've done that for the natural sciences. That was done in CPR, Critique of Pure Reason. And now I'm going to do that for morality. But that's going to take a little more work. So I'm going to do this groundwork thing first. And then we'll get to the actual Metaphysics of Morals, where I'll actually talk about the conditions for the possibility of moral thought in more detail, like the actual non-empirical content of morality, the way that reason shapes our moral experience before we even start looking at stuff in the world and interacting with others. So he thinks an extra step needs to be taken between this process and that. And that project, the actual metaphysics of morals, is in Kant's second critique, which is the critique of practical reason. So this is like the stepping stone between the critique of pure reason and the critique of practical reason. There's this groundwork, which is supposed to illustrate how the two things are connected. And this is Jonathan Bennett's sort of shorthand note to that effect. I'm going to skip it. Feel free to read it yourself. Okay, right. So I have 3 reasons for not plunging straight into a critical examination of pure practical reason, right? So he's going to explain now why is he writing this groundwork thing instead of just giving an account of pure practical reason, instead of just writing the critique of practical reason, the second critique. Why am I doing this? Number 1, it is nowhere near as important to have a critical examination of pure practical reason as it is to have one of pure speculative reason. That is because even in the commonest of minds, human reason can easily be brought into a high level of correctness and completeness in moral matters, whereas reason in its theoretical but pure use is wholly dialectical, meaning that it runs into unavoidable self-contradictions. Okay, so what he's saying here is that it was more important to write the critique of pure reason because people are worse at science than they are at morality, basically. That's his excuse here. He's saying that, like, for the most part, people kind of get morality right, or at least have a better intuitive understanding of how morality works and what, like, to be obligated to do something means. They get that you shouldn't tell lies, right? That's generally not a good thing to do. They have a rough understanding of the basic duties that make up what it means to be a moral person. Even if they don't have, the pure Kantian sense of what morality actually is. He thinks this is a project worth doing, but it was much more important to clear up people's concepts and do the metaphysics with scientific stuff about natural science, about physics, about the physical world, than it is to do the moral stuff. So that's his excuse there. Second reason, when we are conducting a critical examination of pure practical reason, I insist that the job is not finished until practical reason and speculative reason are brought together and unified under a common concept of reason, because ultimately they have to be merely different applications of one and the same reason. But I couldn't achieve this completeness here without confusing the reader by bringing in considerations of an altogether different kind from the matter at hand. That is why I have used the title Groundwork for the Metaphysics of Morals rather than Critique of Pure Practical Reason. Okay, so he went ahead and wrote the Critique of Pure Practical Reason eventually, but this is the groundwork because, again, it's supposed to be the bridge between the two, between the Critique of Pure and the Critique of Practical. Or I should say the Critique of Pure Speculative, the sciencey stuff, and the critique of practical reason, or having to do with the ethical stuff. So this is supposed to show how the two are related. Again, not really sure if he does that. Not sure why he's making these excuses, really, or like explain. I feel like he doesn't have to explain himself here in this much detail. But again, you get what you get. Okay. Number 3, a metaphysics of morals, in spite of its forbidding title, can be done in a popular way, so that people of ordinary intelligence can easily take it in. Oh, thank you. So I find it useful to separate this preliminary work on the foundation, dealing with certain subtleties here, so that I can keep them out of a more comprehensible work that will come later. Right, so he thinks that actually this is where the tougher stuff is. This is where the more demanding philosophy happens, is in the groundwork rather than in the critique of practical reason. Your mileage may vary. Some people think that the critique of practical reason is a much better book. It certainly does a better job doing what Kant tries to do in chapter 3 of this work, which has to do with developing a concept of freedom, and as gleaned from the understanding of the functioning of pure practical reason itself. People think that the Critique of Practical Reason does a much better job than he does in chapter 3 here, which, as we're going to see, is a doozy. So anyway, the tough stuff is here. So those are the reasons. That's why he's writing this book. Okay, thanks. In laying a foundation here, all I am doing is seeking and establishing the supreme principle of morality. That's the categorical imperative. A self-contained and entirely completable task that should be kept separate from every other moral inquiry. Until now, there hasn't been nearly enough attention to this important question of the nature of and basis for the supreme principle of morality. My conclusions about it could be clarified by bringing the supreme principle to bear on the whole system of morality, and confirmed by how well it would serve all through. But I must forego this advantage. Basically, it would gratify me rather than helping anyone else, because the principles being easy to use and its seeming to serve well don't prove for sure that it is right. They are more likely merely to create bias in its favor, which will get in the way of its being ruthlessly probed and evaluated in its own right and without regard to consequences. So we say, look, I know the answer. I know the supreme principle of morality. It's categorical imperative. I have that. And I could just lay out the principle and say, look, here's the categorical imperative, and then just show you how well it works in all these different situations. I could do that, but I'm not going to do it that way. Instead, I'm going to build the categorical imperative for you here in this work. So then when the critique of practical reason comes along, I can use it and then, deduce a whole bunch of stuff having to do with morality, pure morality, that follows from the categorical imperative. But we have to get there first. And this, we're going to skip. So we'll get back to this, but I'll just keep reading Kant for now. In the present work, I have adopted a method that is, I think, most suitable if one wants to proceed analytically from common knowledge to settling what its supreme principle is, and then synthetically from examining this principle and its sources back to common knowledge which it applies. So just ignore Kant's use of analytic and synthetic here. They don't actually mean what they mean everywhere else in Kant's work, where and this is what Jonathan Bennett's paragraph is here, right? The well-known analytic-synthetic distinction, which Kant is famous for probing and uses all the time in the standard way. But here he's talking about an analytic process versus a synthetic process, which is different. And Jonathan Bennett says this goes back to Descartes, although I'm not sure exactly where. And the idea is that what analytic and synthetic mean don't actually matter as much as Kant's description of them, and he could have just deleted these words and avoided a lot of confusion by doing so, but again, you get what you get. So basically he's going to move from common knowledge and say, look, we all have some rough sense of what morality is. Let's abstract away from that and arrive at the pure supreme principles of morality, namely the categorical imperative. And then once we have that, we can deduce the other elements or features of moral life in a pure metaphysical sense, without actually looking at the details of any particular empirical situation, and then have ourselves a complete moral philosophy that we can then set to work in the real world. So this first part of the process that moves from common knowledge to settling the supreme principle, that's what we do in this work. And then in the Critique of Practical Reason, and to some extent in Chapter 3 here, we start moving back down. He's got the categorical imperative, and he wants to go and deduce a bunch of stuff from it that can then be applied to our everyday life. So the work is divided up thus, right? So in Chapter 1, we move from common sense knowledge to philosophical knowledge about morality. And then we move from popular moral philosophy to the metaphysics of morals. And then finally, we move from the metaphysics of morals to a critical examination, to a critique of pure practical reason. So then we start to go back down again, right? So we move up in abstraction from common sense and then start our way back down. But the rest of the way back down doesn't occur until the critique of practical reason, which is a whole other book. Okay, that's the preface. Only an hour, just about an hour, just for the preface. Okay, 4 pages. That's the longest 4 pages maybe ever. I said it was a doozy. There you go. That's the preface. Okay, chapter 1 of the groundwork for the metaphysics of morals. Moving from common sense knowledge to philosophical knowledge about morality. Nothing in the world, or out of it, can possibly be conceived that could be called good without qualification except a good will. Mental talents such as intelligence, wit, and judgment, and temperaments such as courage, resoluteness, and perseverance are doubtless good in many ways and desirable, but they can become extremely bad and harmful if the person's character isn't good. In other words, if the will that is to make use of these gifts of nature isn't good. So he's saying that you need a good will in order to count as morally good. That's the only thing in the world that's actually good, having a good will. Doesn't define this term yet, but it'll make sense. Your intuitive sense will work for now. So, and he's distinguishing whatever a good will is. It's not being intelligent or witty or being courageous or resolute, right? Which are classic virtues, right? That stuff is not good without qualification. Purely good, right? Similarly with gifts of fortune. Power, riches, honor, even health, and the overall well-being and contentment with one's condition that we call happiness create pride, often leading to arrogance. If there isn't a good will to correct their influence on the mind, if there isn't a good will to correct their influence on the mind. Right, so all this stuff can go to your head unless there's a good will to sort of prevent it from going to your head. Not to mention the fact that the sight of someone who shows no sign of a pure and good will, and yet enjoys uninterrupted prosperity, will never give pleasure to an impartial observer. So it seems that without a good will, one can't even be worthy of being happy. So the idea here is that the will is where goodness lies and nowhere else. Right? Goodness does not lie in material welfare. It does not lie in the pursuit of happiness. Whenever we deem somebody good, it is on the grounds of their good will. And if you don't think that, you're just confused. And Kant's reason for thinking that is that, without a good will, we don't consider these things good. So the good will is more fundamental. He'll actually argue for this in a bit, but that's the basic idea. Even qualities that are conducive to this goodwill and can make its work easier have no intrinsic, unconditional worth. We rightly hold them in high esteem, but only because we assume them to be accompanied by a good will. So we can't take them to be absolutely or unconditionally good. Moderation in emotions and passions, self-control and calm deliberation not only are good in many ways, but seem even to constitute part of a person's inner worth. And they were indeed unconditionally valued by the ancients, meaning, Aristotle, virtue ethics, right? These things, having self-control, being moderate, right? These are typically associated with, moral goodness, right? Yet they are very far from being good without qualification, good in themselves, good in any circumstances. For without the principle of a good will, they can become extremely bad. For example, a villain's coolness make him far more dangerous and more straightforwardly abominable to us than he would otherwise have seemed. So think of like the stoic murderer or something. Kant is saying, can you think of that? Can you think of somebody who is moderate in emotions and self-control and calm and deliberate and, ticks all the boxes of an ancient virtuous person according to Aristotle, and still, can you come up with a situation where somebody has all those qualities and is still evil or not morally good? If you can, then goodness is somewhere else, right? It's something else. And in fact, it's in what Kant calls a good will. But what is it that makes a good will good? It isn't what it brings about, or its usefulness in achieving some intended end. Rather, goodwill is good because of how it wills. In other words, it is good in itself. Taken just in itself, it is to be valued incomparably more highly than anything that could be brought about by it in the satisfaction of some preference, or if you like, the sum total of all preferences. So we'll unpack this a little bit. This is where Kant is talking about, it's about the motives that make an action morally good, not the consequences, right? So he's arguing against a teleological or a consequentialist view of morality, which says things are good in virtue of what they bring about. Kant is saying, no, that's not what makes a thing good. You can act in ways that bring about all sorts of good results, but that are not morally creditworthy, right? That are not good actions if you don't have the right reason behind it, the good will behind it. And we all know this. And here we're going to, consider a case, right? Consider this case. Through bad luck or a miserly endowment from stepmotherly nature, this person's will has no power at all to accomplish its purpose. Not even the greatest effort on his part would be able to achieve anything it aims at, but he still does have a good will. Not as a mere wish, but as the summoning of all the means in his power. The good will of this person would sparkle like a jewel all by itself, as something that has its full worth in itself. Its value wouldn't go up or down depending on how useful or fruitless it was. If it was useful, that would only be the setting of the jewel, so to speak, enabling us to handle it more conveniently in commerce. A diamond ring is easier to manage than a diamond, after all, or to get those who don't know much about jewels to look at it. But the setting doesn't affect the value of the jewel and doesn't recommend it to the experts. So again, the idea of a good will, if you take away everything else, every other power in a person's life, right? If this person can't actually do anything, can't actually accomplish anything, they're just like totally down on their luck, or they're, they can't have any positive effect on their life or anyone else's, but they still have a good will. They still want to follow the moral law. They want to be a good person. They have a good will, even if all the material aspects of their life are totally, fruitless. We would still recognize that, yeah, that's a good person, right? That person has a good will, and we can all see that, right? Even if the things that they do or try to do all fail. So that's the kind of counterexample that Kant is trying to draw here to get us to stop thinking about morality in terms of outcomes. It's in terms of the will. The will is what makes an act moral or not. So he's going to build on this. But there is something extremely strange in this idea of the absolute worth of the will, of the mere will, with no account taken of any use to which it is put. It is indeed so strange that despite the agreement of even common sense, an agreement that I have exhibited in the preceding 3 paragraphs, you're bound to suspect that there may be nothing to it but high-flown fancy, and that I have misunderstood what nature was up to in appointing reason as the ruler of our will. So let us critically examine the idea from the point of view of suspicion. So now he's saying, you might not believe this, right? Or you might believe this, but you might be suspicious. You might not be buying what I'm selling here. So he's gonna mount and respond to an objection, which is that maybe, nature was up to something else in appointing reason as the ruler of our will. And again, this is like he introduces ideas without introducing the terminology first. It's very frustrating, but we'll go ahead. Sometimes you just got to keep reading, and then it makes sense. So we take it as an axiom that the natural constitution of an organized being, namely one that's suitably adapted to life, no organ would be found that isn't perfectly adapted to its purpose, whatever that is. So this is like a classic Enlightenment teleological account of living things, right? The eyes are designed for seeing, the The guts are designed for processing food, and the mind is designed for being reasonable or rational, right? And we are designed as human beings to be rational. We have a teleology. This comes from Aristotle. We don't believe this anymore because we all know evolution, but it was a very common idea back in the day. Now suppose that nature's real purpose for you, a being with reason and will, were that you should survive, thrive, and be happy. In that case, nature would have hit upon a very poor arrangement in appointing your reason to carry out this purpose. For all the actions that you need to perform in order to carry out this intention of nature, and indeed the entire regulation of your conduct, would be marked out for you much more exactly and reliably by instinct than it ever could be by reason. And if nature had favored you by giving you reason as well as instinct, the role of reason would have been to let you contemplate the happy constitution of your nature, to admire it, to rejoice in it, and to be grateful for it to its beneficent cause, not to let you subject your faculty of desire to that weak and delusive guidance, and to interfere with nature's purpose. In short, nature would have taken care that reason didn't intrude into practical morality and have that presumption, with its weak insight, to think out for itself the plan of happiness and how to get it. Nature would have taken over the choice not only of ends, but also of the means to them, and with wise foresight she would have entrusted both to instinct alone. So, what does all this mean? This means that, look, if the goal in life was to be, happy, healthy, survive, have kids, whatever, enjoy life, right? If that was the goal, reason, is not a great thing to have, right? Look at animals. Look at my dog, for example. My dog, its purpose in life, if it has one, is to eat, go for a walk, go do its business outside, and sleep most of the time. Get a pet once in a while, and that's it. That's all. That's all a dog needs to have a pretty happy life. Of course, dogs can get spoiled, and my dog is spoiled, but that's about it. That's about all there is to being a dog. And if that was if our life as human beings was, if our purpose in life was just to be like that, maybe amped up a little bit, as someone like John Stuart Mill thinks, then we don't really need reason, right? Because my dog doesn't need reason to have a life like that. My dog just my dog would figure that stuff out on its own. It knows exactly what it needs, and instinct guides it to food when it's hungry. It guides it to sleep when it's tired. It guides it to exercise when it needs to go for a walk, or it would anyway. The dog lets me know when he needs a walk, right? That's all instinct. There's no reason going on. So if our goal in life was to live a life like that, if our purpose was to live a life like that, then reason just gets in the way, right? Reason is not a very good guide to life if that is our goal. That's Kant's point here. And he's gonna build this more, so I'll stop there. What we find, in fact, is that the more a cultivated reason devotes itself to the enjoyment of life and happiness, the more the person falls short of true contentment. Which is why many people, especially those who have made the greatest use of reason, have a certain hostility towards reason, though they may not be candid enough to admit it. They have drawn many advantages from reason, never mind about its role in the inventions that lead to ordinary luxuries. My interest is in the advantages of intellectual pursuits, which eventually seem to these people to be also a luxury of the understanding. But after looking over all this, they find that they have actually brought more trouble on themselves than they have gained in happiness. And eventually, they come not to despise, but to envy the common run of people who stay closer to merely natural instinct and don't give reason much influence on their doings. So again, this is sort of just reiterating the point that reason sort of gets in the way of the simple pleasures, right? The more we learn about the world, the more we study, the more we try to, set ourselves goals and live in accordance with those goals, the more stuff we give ourselves to do each day, the more miserable we are, right? The more frustrated we are, the more we have on our plate, the more we have to eat, so to speak, and the less of it we can actually eat, and this is frustrating. And sometimes I look at my dog and I say, man, that, if only I could be as happy and satisfied as a dog sometimes. But we're not, right? We're not, because we have reason, right? And so reason conflicts with this idea that the ultimate goal in life is, survival and happiness and the satisfaction of pleasure, or, in the most general sense, according to Kant, to the pursuit of certain material ends or consequences. So much for the drawbacks of well-being and happiness as one's dominant aim in life. As for those who play down or outright deny the boastful eulogies that are given of the happiness and contentment that reason can supposedly bring us, the judgment they are making doesn't involve gloom or ingratitude for how the world is governed. Rather, it is based on the idea of another far nobler purpose for their existence. It is for achieving this purpose, not happiness, that reason is properly intended. And this purpose is the supreme condition, so that the private purposes of men must, for the most part, take second place to it. Its being the supreme or highest condition means that it isn't in itself conditional on anything else. It is to be aimed at no matter what else is the case, which is why our private plans must stand out of its way. Right? So he's saying that, reason itself, right? The fact that we have reason itself, and it's meddling in our lives, and it's pulling us away from the mere pursuit of pleasure. That is evidence that we have a higher calling. We have a higher purpose. And that higher purpose transcends any of our private plans of the kind of life that we want to live. That higher purpose is independent of any of that stuff. And all of our other things that we want to do, where we want to go for dinner, what we want to be when we grow up, that's all secondary to the demands of reason itself, as Kant sees it. Okay? And that is the supreme and highest condition. What is it? Kant's going to tell us it's categorical imperative, but we're not there yet. He's just saying that there must exist a supreme and higher condition that doesn't depend on anything else below it. It has to be the end of reason, right? So reason isn't competent to act as a guide that will lead the will reliably to its objectives and will satisfy all our needs. Indeed, it adds to our needs. An implanted instinct would do this job much more reliably. Like, again, look at my dog. Nevertheless, reason is given to us as a practical faculty, that is, one that is meant to have an influence on the will. Its proper function must be to produce a will that is good in itself, and not good as a means. It's good in itself, not as a means to an end. Why? And he gives 3 reasons. Because nature has everywhere distributed the capacity suitable to the function they are to perform. Right? The means to good are, as I have pointed out, better provided for by instinct. And third, reason and it alone can produce a will that is good in itself. Okay, so this he already said, right? Nature sort of gives everything its purpose. That's fine. The means to good are better provided for by instinct, right? Meaning that if I wanted to live a life that keeps me full all the time, I would just trust my instinct, to eat when I'm hungry, right? And reason alone can provide a will or produce a will that is good in itself, right? Meaning that we only consider. Okay, so this packing too much into this line. So remember back to the example of the guy who is, everything is wrong in his life, but he still has a good will. Usually, we only ascribe that to human beings, to rational beings, right? We can only call somebody morally good if they are a rational being. It doesn't make sense to call my dog morally good. My dog is not morally good. My dog doesn't know what it means to have a moral obligation to do something or to have a good will. My dog can be loyal, right? We can describe its behavior with morally charged terminology, sure, but it's not a morally good being without rationality. That is a product of reason and reason alone. This good will needn't be the sole and complete good, but it must be the condition of all others, even of the desire for happiness. Okay, so, man, he just moves like so fast. Like, this guy. Okay, so the goodwill doesn't need to be the sole and complete good, but it must be the condition of all others, meaning that like we can't understand what it means to be good in any other respect until we understand what it means to have a good will. So we have to consider two purposes. First is the unconditional purpose of producing a good will, and the second is the conditional purpose of being happy. Right? So producing a good will, this is an unconditional purpose of human life because it is necessary to have, or it is implied by the functioning, well or otherwise, of reason itself, that we have a good will. That is like the ultimate goal, the ultimate good in all life is the production or the having of a good will, which is contingent on being a rational being. And that is the unconditional purpose of any rational being, is producing a good will. That's what Kant means by that, right? So being a good person, having a good will, is like the goal for anything that is rational. That he's claimed so far. If you're following him and his system, I guess this counts as an argument for it, right? The example before, but that's where we're at right now. Okay, and then there's the conditional purpose of being happy, right? So being happy is something else. It's contingent. It's conditional, right? So being happy, again, if we wanted to just be happy, all we have to do is like eat when we're hungry and exercise when we're feeling like it and resting when we feel like it, right? And just following instinct. That stuff can lead us to happiness. But having a good will is something that we need reason for. And that's why it's more important. And that's why it's uniquely moral. Of these two, one requires the cultivation of reason, which, at least in this life, in many ways limits and indeed can almost eliminate, too, the goal of happiness. This state of affairs is entirely compatible with the wisdom of nature. It doesn't have nature pursuing its goal clumsily, because reason, recognizing that its highest practicing call is to establish a good will, can, by achieving that goal, get a contentment of its own kind, the kind that comes from attaining a goal set by reason, even though this gets in the way of things that the person merely prefers. So he's trying to defend the idea of reason being the ultimate goal, even though reason gets in the way of happiness. Because this is like an objection, because you might say like, if you're saying that, aren't you saying that then the ultimate goal of life is to be miserable and to just do whatever reason says, no matter how miserable or unpleasant it might be? And Kant is saying, no, it doesn't conflict in that way. He's saying, even though reason does get in the way of, our mere desires, it provides its own kind of contentment that isn't contingent upon any circumstances either. Okay, he's going to build that. So we have to develop the concept of a will that is to be esteemed as good in itself with regard to anything else. The concept that always takes first place in judging the total worth of our actions, with everything else dependent on it. Because again, when we deem something morally good, we deem it good sort of regardless of whatever the consequences are, or whatever the outcomes are, right? If somebody has a good will, we look at the way that they are using their mind, the way that they are using their faculty of reason. That's what it takes to determine if someone is doing something good or not. And everything else and all the other details in the situation depend on that. And we need to develop a concept that is already lodged in any natural and sound understanding and doesn't need to be taught so much as to be brought to light. In order to develop and unfold it, I'll dig into the concept of duty, which contains it. So again, this is Kant saying, look, I'm not inventing new stuff. I'm not trying to impose a law from outside. I'm saying, look, you already know what you're supposed to do. You already have a sense of morality. You already get what it means to be moral. You already get it. You are a rational being. And if you are a rational being, you do. This is not new. This is not imposed from without. I just need to clarify things for you. I need to purify and abstract away all the empirical stuff in your day-to-day life to identify, the moral moment, right? Or the pure essence of morality, which is this here, right? The idea of a goodwill that is good in itself, that always takes first place when we evaluate something morally, and this concept being already in our day-to-day understanding. That's a precondition, right? And he's going to look at the concept of duty. He says that the concept of duty contains this moral essence, right? The moral moment, we might call it. The concept of a good will is present in the concept of duty, not shining out in all its objective and unconditional glory, but rather in a manner that brings it under certain subjective restrictions and hindrances. But these are far from concealing it or disguising it, for rather they bring it out by contrast and make it shine forth all the more brightly. I shall now look at this contrast. So he's saying that the idea, when we think about duties, think about situations where we have a duty to do something, and we evaluate somebody acting in accordance with a duty, and what it means to say that somebody is doing a morally good thing when they fulfill their duty, right? Think of all the different circumstances where this could happen, and he's going to give us examples. Once we give that analysis and isolate duty within that context, that's when we start doing moral philosophy. And it's it's not easy to do. It requires a lot of abstract thinking, but it's something that we sort of intuitively do all the time, right? We can identify when somebody is doing the right thing for the wrong reason, for example, right? And because we can do that, we have an intuitive sense of duty already. Kant is just trying to seize on that and purify it, identify it in all its moral glory. Okay. So he goes on. My topic is the difference between doing something from duty and doing it for other reasons. In tackling this, I shall set aside without discussion two kinds of case, one for which my questions don't arise, or one for which my question doesn't arise, and a second for which the question arises, but is too easy to answer for the case to be interesting and instructive. Following these two, I shall introduce two further kinds of case. 1. I shan't discuss any actions which, even if they are useful in some way or other, are clearly opposed to duty, because with them the question of doing them from duty doesn't even arise. I shall also ignore cases where someone does A, which really is in accordance with duty, but where what he directly wants isn't to perform A, but to perform B, which somehow leads to or involves A. For example, he unbolts the door so as to escape from the fire, and in so doing he enables others to escape also. There is no need to spend time on such cases, because in them it is easy to tell whether an action that is in accordance with duty is done from duty or rather for some selfish purpose. Right, so these cases are easy. We're not going to talk about those, right? If I accidentally help somebody, which it might be my duty to help to begin with, if I do so accidentally or incidentally, then it doesn't count as me doing something morally good. Kant saying I'm not talking about those. Here are the two cases that are a bit more tricky. 3. It is far harder to detect that difference when the action of the person, or when the action the person performs, one that is in accord with duty, is what he directly wanted to do, rather than being something that he did only because it was involved in doing something else that he directly wanted to do. Take the example of a shopkeeper who charges the same price for selling his goods to inexperienced customers as for selling them to anyone else. This is in accord with duty. But there is also a prudential and non-duty-based motive that the shopkeeper might have for this course of conduct. When there is a buyer's market, he may sell as cheaply to children as to others so as to not lose customers. Thus the customer is honestly served, but we can't infer from this that the shopkeeper has behaved in this way from duty and principles of honesty. His own advantage requires this behavior, and we can't assume that in addition he directly wants something for his customers and out of love for them he charges them all the same price. His conduct of his policy on pricing comes neither from duty nor from directly wanting it, but from a selfish purpose. Okay, so imagine somebody who treats people fairly, right? Who wants to treat people fairly. Like, the goal is to treat all my customers equally, but not because it's my duty to do so, but because it's in my interest to do so. Because if I start cheating my customers, or if I start, if I sell stuff to the kids for a higher price than I sell to the adults, the kids are going to find out, and they're not going to come to my shop anymore, right? So I have to treat everyone fairly for my own selfish reasons, not because it is my duty to do so, even if it is my duty to do so, and I'm acting in accordance with that duty. So he's saying that, like, we all kind of agree on this, right? We can all see this. It's a little tricky. We have to come up with a case that's, has some ins and outs in order to see it, but we all get it, right? We all get the difference between doing something that is merely in accordance with a moral duty and acting from a sense of moral duty. We all get this. Okay, and Jonathan Bennett here has a note about Kant's German being, like, kind of tricky and not very good, not very easy to understand. But yeah, so there you go. But that's the example. 4. It is a duty to preserve one's life, and moreover, everyone directly wants to do so. But because of the power of that want, the often anxious care that most men have for their survival has no intrinsic, meaning no moral, worth. And the maxim, preserve yourself, has no moral content. Men preserve their lives according to duty, but not from duty. Okay, so Kant believes that we have a duty to preserve our lives, meaning that ending your own life is against the moral law. Kant doesn't explain this here. I think he might get into this in chapter 2 when he talks about the categorical imperative and when he starts to deduce, like, other duties from the categorical imperative. Definitely in the Critique of Practical Reason he does this, but for now he just says it. He just gives it as an example, that it is a duty to preserve our life. But most of the times when we are acting in the interest of self-preservation, it's not a morally, it's not like it's not done from a sense of duty to preserve our life. It's just done from instinct, from self-interest. And he's saying that this case is really interesting because it's much harder to separate the duty from the mere self-preservation interest, or the mere interest to self-preservation. In this case, it's much more difficult. But now consider this case. Adversities and hopeless sorrow have completely taken away this unfortunate man's relish for life, but his fate has not made him passively despondent or dejected. He is strong in soul, and is exasperated at how things have gone for him, and would like actively to do something about it. Specifically, he wishes for death, but he preserves his life without loving it, not led by any want or fear, but acting from duty. For this person, the maxim, preserve yourself, has moral content, right? So again, this is just a counterexample to isolate the moral moment, that we might call it, right? So, like, even if somebody wishes for death, he knows that, it is my duty to preserve my life, which is a gift or whatever, and so I'm not going to take that step, right? And for this person, Kant thinks, somebody who might want to not be among the living anymore, but refuses to take that step because, they have a duty to preserve their own life and recognize that they have that duty. That is a moral moment for them when they preserve themselves. We have a duty to be charitably helpful where we can, and many people are so sympathetically constituted that without any motive of vanity or selfishness, they find an inner satisfaction in spreading joy, and take delight in the contentment of others if they have made it possible. But I maintain that such behavior, done in that spirit, has no true moral worth, however amiable it may be, and however much it accords with duty. It should be classed with actions done from other wants, such as the desire for honor. With luck, someone's desire for honor may lead to conduct that in fact accords with duty and does good to many people. In that case, it deserves praise and encouragement. But it doesn't deserve high esteem because the maxim on which the person is acting doesn't have the moral content of an action done not because the person likes acting in that way, but from duty. So again, he's talking about people who do nice things, who do the right thing for the wrong sort of reason, not wrong in an immoral sense, right? So like the shopkeeper example, that's a little less interesting, right? Because then it's like purely self-interest. But when we find people who are genuinely motivated to help others because of how good it makes them feel, that's a bit trickier, right? You tell the shopkeeper that, you're not really doing anything morally good here. You're just looking out for your bottom line. And the shopkeeper might say like, yeah, you're right. Yeah, actually, yeah. But when we tell, the extremely charitable person that, hey, you're not really acting from a moral sense of duty when you go to the soup kitchen on the weekend. You're actually just doing it because it makes you feel good. And that's fine, but that's not, morally creditworthy. That's a tougher sell, but Kant thinks that that's the way morality works. Okay, now consider this special case. Or consider a special case. This person has been a friend to mankind, but his mind has become so clouded by sorrow of his own that has extinguished all feeling for how others are faring. He still has the power to benefit others in distress, but their need leaves him untouched because he is too preoccupied with his own. But now he tears himself out of this dead insensibility and acts charitably purely from duty, without feeling any want or liking so to behave. Now, for the first time, his conduct has genuine moral worth. Having been deprived by nature of a warm-hearted temperament, this man could find in himself a source from which to give himself a far higher worth than he could have got through such a temperament. It is just here that the worth of character is brought out, which is morally the incomparably highest of all. He is beneficent not from preference, but from duty. So imagine somebody who goes to the soup kitchen and feels really good about it, and who lives their life that way, but then all of a sudden, right, they get the gloomies. They get really depressed, and going to the soup kitchen doesn't bring them any joy anymore, and they don't get any satisfaction from helping others. There's no psychological benefit to doing that anymore. And that person doesn't quit. They go anyway. Right? They say, yeah, but it's actually my duty to help others, and people are relying on me to show up. And I need to go to the soup kitchen because I said I would be there, and I made a promise. And I have a duty to help these other people. Even if I really don't want to go, I'm going to go anyway. Kant says that's it. That's where morality is. That's what's happening. That's the moral moment, and we all agree that that is a morally good thing to do, to go against your preferences and desires and ignore the fact that, I really don't feel like going in today, and doing it anyway. That's morality. That's where it's happening. Okay. To secure one's own happiness is a duty, at least indirectly, because discontent with one's condition, bundled along by many cares and unmet needs, could easily become a great temptation to transgress against duties. But quite apart from duty, all men have the strongest and deepest desire for happiness, because in the idea of happiness, all our desires are brought together in a single sum total. But the injunction, be happy, often takes a form in which it thwarts some desires, so that a person can't get a clear and secure concept of the sum total of satisfactions that goes under the name happiness. So it isn't surprising that the prospect of a single satisfaction, definite as to what it is and when it can be had, can outweigh a fluctuating idea such as that of happiness. For example, a man with the gout, a painful ailment made worse by alcohol and rich food, can choose to enjoy what he likes and put up with the consequences because according to his calculation, this time anyway, he hasn't sacrificed present pleasure to a possibly groundless expectation of the happiness that health is supposed to bring. But even for this man, whose will is not settled by the general desire for happiness, and for whom health plays no part in his calculations, there still remains, as there does for everyone, the law that he ought to promote his happiness, not from wanting or liking, but from duty. Only by following this could his conduct have true moral worth. Okay, the details of this case, I'm not super sold that they matter, but again, he's talking about, doing things, pursuing your own happiness because you feel like it, right? Because it satisfies some need of yours, or because it's your duty to do. And Kant thinks that it is our duty to pursue happiness, at least to some extent, at least indirectly, because if we don't pursue our happiness, if we don't try to live our lives as comfortably as possible, we're more likely to be morally bad. Right? If our lives are miserable and unpleasant, and we don't take care of ourselves, and we're in pain all the time, then we're just a drag on everyone around us. Right? We are less likely to be morally good if we are in extreme pain all the time, for example. So it is an indirect duty, Kant thinks, to secure our own happiness. Now again, when Kant says to secure our own happiness is a duty, or to preserve our life is a duty, he's not giving arguments for this yet, because again, he thinks that these are kind of commonsensical. I'll give you the deductions in the Critique of Practical Reason. It's coming, right? I'll tell you why I think that is. But for now, I think we can all agree that, at least in some sense, this is a duty. I won't give you the full story why I think that is, but at least it's on the face of it, believable enough in common sense. And again, he's starting at common sense here. Okay? And he's saying that, we can pursue our happiness from inclination, from, the desire, from the need to fulfill a desire, and we can also pursue our happiness from a sense of duty, right? So that distinction. And again, the second thing is the moral thing. No doubt, this is how we should understand passages that command us to love our neighbor and even our enemy. We can't be commanded to feel love for someone or to simply prefer that he thrive. There are two sorts of love: practical love that lies in the will and in principles of actions, and pathological love, meaning emotional or pathos, love that lies in the direction of the person's feeling and tender sympathies alike. The latter of these cannot be commanded, but the former can be. And this is a command to do good to others from duty, even when you don't want to do it or like doing it, and indeed even when you naturally and unconquerably hate doing it. Right? So he's saying that, when the Bible tells us to love our enemies, it's commanding that in the sense of duty. It's saying, look, no matter how much you hate somebody, how much they get in your way of you getting what you want, you still should direct your will in such a way that is loving and towards their benefit. Okay. So much for the first proposition of morality, which is for an action to have genuine moral worth, it must be done from duty. And I'm pretty sure this is Jonathan Bennett's approximation, because I think Kant doesn't actually say the first proposition of morality. He just like all of this is supposed to be like the first proposition of morality. He doesn't actually put it in this sentence, but that's what it is. Right? For an action to have genuine moral worth, it must be done from duty. Right? And that's what all this is about. All right? So that's pretty clear. The second proposition is this: an action that is done from duty doesn't get its moral value from the purpose that's to be achieved through it, but from the maxim that it involves, giving the reason why the person acts thus. Right? So it's not about the outcomes, it's about the motive. And this is like a classic way of understanding Kant's deontology, right? Or deontological ethics in general, right? It's not that, doing X, going to the soup kitchen is a good thing because people benefit from you being there. Going to the soup kitchen is the good thing because you promised you were going to go, because it's your duty to go, because you can, and you said you were going to be there. And helping others when we can is a duty. And doing it because it's a duty, that's where morality happens. So the action's moral value doesn't depend on whether what is aimed at in it is actually achieved, but solely on the principle of the will from which the action is done, irrespective of anything the faculty of desire may be aiming at. From what I have said, it is clear that the purposes we may have in acting and their effects as drivers of the will towards desired ends can't give our actions any unconditional value, any moral value. Right? So, having desires can't be, or acting in accordance with our desires isn't what it means to be moral. It can't be. It's acting from the will in accordance with duty. Right? That is where morality happens. Well then, if the action's moral value isn't to be found in the will and its relation to its hoped-for effect, then where can it be found? The only possible source for it is the principle on which the will acts. Never mind the ends that may be achieved by the action, right? So it's the principle, right? You showing up to pick up your kid at school isn't good because your kid is happy when you do so. It's good because you said you were going to do it, because you made a promise, right? Because it's your duty to do it, and you recognize that duty and act in accordance with it, even when you don't really feel like doing it. That's where morality happens. For the will stands at the crossroads, so to speak, at the intersection between its a priori principle, which is formal, and its a posteriori driver, the contingent desire that acts on it, which is material. In that position, it must be determined by something, and if it is done from duty, it must be determined by the formal principle of the will. Since every material principle, every contingent driver of the will, has been withdrawn from it. So again, this idea that truly moral motives are formal in the sense that they are a priori, they don't depend on any particular feature of the situation. They are built into the concept of duty and to the exercise of the will itself. The third proposition, a consequence of the first two, I would express as follows. To have a duty is to be required to act in a certain way out of respect for the law. Okay, so now he's giving the third proposition of morality, right? The first being, you gotta do things from duty in order for it to count as being moral. And the second being that the motive is what matters, right? The motive, not the end or the purpose or the goal, right? The maxim it involves, the reason why you're doing something, right? It's about the reason for doing something, not just the mere fact that you're doing something in accordance with duty. And now he's giving the third proposition, which is sort of like a definition of duty, right? To have a duty is to be required to act in a certain way out of respect for the law. As for what will result from my action, I can certainly prefer or be drawn to it, but I can't have respect for it. So this idea of respect is going to be really important. To earn my respect, it would have to be something the will does, not merely something that its doing leads to. Similarly, I can't respect any want or preference. If it is someone else's, I can even love it. Namely, I can see it as favorable to my interest. What can get respect, and thus can serve as a command, is something that isn't a consequence of my volition, but only a source for it, and isn't in the service of my preferences, but rather overpowers them, or at least prevents them from being considered in the choice I make. This something, in a word, is the law itself. Right? So he's given the idea of a moral law, right? Which is what commands our respect. So when we respect the law and act in accordance with it, that's where morality is. So again, think, I got to go to the soup kitchen this week. I said I was going to be there. I made a promise. Everyone's counting on me. I got to go no matter how much I don't want to, right? Even if I call in sick and say, I don't feel like coming in today, nobody would be worse off for it, right? Even if, we'll call in Joe to replace you or whatever. No problem. That's fine. Feel better. But you have to tell a lie to do that, right? Yeah, and you're falling short of your promise, right? But when you don't go that route and you show up and you say, I really don't want to go in today, but I'm going to go in anyway. That's where morality happens. And that's because we have respect for the moral law that we've created for ourselves by virtue of making a promise, or by virtue of recognizing that helping others is a duty when we can do so, and that my merely not feeling like going in today isn't a good enough reason to overpower the law, right? The duty that I have to go in. And recognizing that is where morality happens. Suppose now that someone acts from duty. The influence of his preferences can't have anything to do with this, and so facts about what he might achieve by his action don't come into it either. So what is left? What is there left that can lead him to act as he does? If the question means what is there objectively, in other words, distinct from himself, that determines his will in this case, the only possible answer is a law. Again, laws of freedom, right? This is why morality is a science, because there's a law that needs to be respected. It might not be respected, right? Because again, these are about laws of the way the world ought to be, right? These are about oughts, not ises, right? These aren't laws of nature. These are laws of freedom. These are laws that govern the use of the will in accordance with nature, right? They are laws about the way things should be, not the way things are actually, in fact, right? And they are hardwired into us. And when we act out of respect for those laws, we are acting morally. And if the question concerns what there is in the person that influences his will, in other words, what subjectively influences it, the answer has to be his respect for this practical law, and thus his acceptance of the maxim that I am to follow this law even if it thwarts all my desires. A maxim is a subjective principle of volition. The objective principle is the practical law itself. It would also be the subjective principle for all rational beings if reason fully controlled the formation of preferences, right? So the difference between saying like, I should follow this law, that's a maxim, or, so-and-so or anybody should do something to follow that law, whereas the law itself is the objective portion of it, right? So the volition is the subjective, whereas the law itself is objective, meaning, it's not, it doesn't depend on our perception of it. So this isn't super necessary, and it might be more trouble than it's worth. And Kant just, again, I'll just add that in parentheses here. Thanks. Okay. So an action's moral value doesn't lie in the effect that is expected from it, or in any principle of action that motivates it because of this expected effect. All the expected effects, something agreeable for me or even happiness for others, could be brought about through other causes and don't need the will of a rational being. Whereas the highest good, what is unconditionally good, can be found only in such a will. So this wonderful good, which can be called moral goodness, can't consist in anything but the thought of law in itself that only a rational being can have, with the will being moved to act by this thought and not by the hoped-for effect of the action. Right? So again, here is morality, and here is why only rational beings can be moral. Right? Because that's true, right? Only rational beings can be moral. My dog can't be moral. My dog doesn't have reason, and therefore it can't be moral. Only rational beings can be moral. My dog can do things that are good, that I like. My dog can, be loyal, right? But its motives in such cases are still instinctual, right? It doesn't have that higher order power of directing our actions or directing its actions in the same way that we can as rational, autonomous beings, right? And that's why only we can be moral. And understanding what makes us, what gives us that ability to be moral is the key to understanding morality itself. That's why morality and rationality are so closely tied together, right? They appear concurrently. There must be a relationship, according to Kant, and figuring out the way that reason works is how we figure out how morality works. And that's why this is a continuation of the critique of pure reason, and that's why the critique of practical reason has this similar theme as being about the use of reason itself. Because again, morality depends on rationality. Okay, and therefore, because morality depends on rationality, it is only through the exercise of reason, namely through respect for the law, which is something that only a rational being can do, that morality is possible. Right? It's only in that context that it's possible. When the person acts according to this conception, this moral goodness is already present in him. We don't have to look for it in the upshot of his action. Okay, so Kant is explaining this, but he's doing it in a way that's sort of defending at the same time. He's swatting away consequentialists. He's swatting away people who think that morality is determined by the outcomes of one's actions, right? Like you should go to the soup kitchen because it helps people. Kant says, no, that's not what morality is, right? You can go to the soup kitchen and help people, but like there are all sorts of other ways that you can do that. Dogs could, go to the soup kitchen and help people and make people feel better, I guess, if it's instinctually in their interest to do so. A billionaire could go to a soup kitchen and help people and pose for a photo op to promote their public image or whatever, right? That's not morality, right? That's not morality. Morality is going to the soup kitchen when you don't feel like it because you said you were going to be there, right? That's where morality is, according to Kant. Okay. So we have a law, the thought of which can settle the will without reference to any expected result, and must do so if the will is to be called absolutely good without qualification. What kind of law can this be? Well, since I have robbed the will of any impulses that could have come to it from obeying any law, nothing remains to serve as a guiding principle of the will except the conducts universally conforming to law as such. That is, I ought never to act in such a way that I couldn't also will that the maxim on which I act should be a universal law. Okay, so this is the categorical imperative. This is it, right? We've worked our way up to it. It doesn't come out of nowhere, but the argument is like squished into these two super dense sentences. But the idea is basically this. There's nothing else in this conception of morality as respect for a law and acting in accordance with duty. There's nothing else to this except for the fact that all rational beings have it. Right? It's not contingent on any experience. It's just what it means to be moral is to act in accordance with duty, whatever that duty is, out of respect for the law that duty represents. That's something that only moral beings can do. And so it can't have any other additional content to it. It can't have any other features except for universality, except for the fact that it applies to all rational beings. That's the only other thing that's allowed in to this conception of morality. And that's where the categorical imperative comes from, right? The fact that I should only act in such a way that I couldn't, or I ought never to act in such a way that I couldn't also will that the maxim on which I act should be a universal law. Because morality only deals with universal laws. That's the point. And this imperative follows from that. The fact that moral laws are universal. Therefore, anything that I am morally obligated to do has the shape of a universal law. In this context, the guiding principle of the will is conformity to the law as such, not bringing in any particular law governing some class of actions, and it must serve as the will's principle if duty is not to be a vain delusion and chimerical concept. Common sense in its practical judgments is in perfect agreement with this and constantly has this principle in view. Okay, so he's saying that, even though this sounds like super abstract and crazy and like, categorical imperative, wow, it's so abstract and, It doesn't even have any like content. How do you apply this in daily life? Kant is going to say, actually, this works with our everyday understanding of morality and the demands that we have on each other. Okay, I just realized that I forgot this footnote here, which is about the feeling of respect and a potential objection, because Kant was also, I said he was swatting away consequentialists. He's also swatting away sentimentalists, right? Sentimentalist moral theory believes that morality is a function of our feelings, of our sentiments, right? And so if Kant is saying that, morality is about respect for the law, somebody might say that, you're sneaking emotions into your account of morality. And really, at bottom, it's about the emotion that's felt by respect. And so Kant has a response to this in this footnote here, right? It might be objected that I try to take refuge in an obscure feeling behind the word respect, instead of clearing things up through the concept of reason. Right, so feeling versus reason, sentimentalism versus Kant. Although respect is indeed a feeling, it doesn't come from outer influence. Rather, it is a feeling that a rational concept creates unaided. So it is different in kind from all the feelings caused from outside, the ones that can come from desire or fear. Right, so we say that respect is a uniquely rational feeling, right? It is a unique feeling that only a rational being can have, and therefore it is a product of reason. It's not a matter of identifying the moral feelings that we have out in the world, like fear or happiness or desire, right? It's something that only exists in the context of respect for a law, which is something that's built into us as rational beings. So this is why it's not a contradiction or undermining his account that respect for the law has such a central place. But we'll go on. I'll let Kant explain it. When I directly recognize something as a law for myself, I recognize it with respect, which merely means that I am conscious of submitting my will to a law without interference from any other influences on my mind. The will is being directly settled by law, and the consciousness of this happening is called respect. So respect should be seen as an effect of the law's operation on the person's will, not as a cause of it. So it's not like respect is the fundamental element of nature, right? Respect is just an effect. It's an indicator. It lets us know that morality is happening when we feel respect. So it is a feeling. It's essential to morality, but it's not the source, the metaphysical source of morality being in the feeling of respect. That's not what's going on, as a sentimentalist might show, right? A sentimentalist might say, no, the feeling of respect, that's where morality is, and you should analyze that feeling of respect to find morality along with all the other moral feelings. Whereas Kant is saying, no, respect is a product. It is the effect, not the cause. Really, respect is the thought of a value that breaks down my self-love. Thus, it is not something to be either desired or feared, though it has something analogous to both desire and fear in it. The only thing that can be respected is law, and it has to be the law that we impose on ourselves, yet recognize as necessary in itself. As a law, it makes us subject to it without consulting our self-love, which gives it some analogy to fear, right? So when the law, when we recognize that, that's a law, I gotta do this, it's similar to fear in the sense that we don't have any control over it. We're kind of powerless in the face of it. So in that sense, it has some analogy to fear. And as imposed on us by ourselves, right, it is a consequence of our will, which gives it some analogy to preference, right? So it's kind of like a preference insofar as we are responsible for it. Right, so like when I say I'm going to record this video, or I am going to go to the soup kitchen, I have created that obligation on myself, and that generates the feeling of respect that maybe motivates me to do the activity, to record the video, to go to the soup kitchen. But that's not, that doesn't undermine the fact that, it's the law and duty at work here that are doing the heavy lifting for where morality is. This is really the only basic sense of the term respect. Any respect for a person is only respect for the law of righteousness, etc., of which the person provides an example. Our respect for a person's talents, for instance, is our recognition that we ought to practice until we are as talented as he is. We see him as a kind of example of a law because we regard it as our duty to improve our talents, right? So if we want to be a musician and we respect somebody as a musician because they are so talented, we recognize them as an example of a law, right? That we ought to follow if we want to be as good as they are. So respect for persons is a disguised form of respect for law. All moral concern, as it is called, consists solely in respect for the law, right? So all moral concern, right? And this is, again, the language of sentimentalism, right? All moral concern, moral sentiments, that feeling of respect that overwhelms our feeling of laziness to go to the soup kitchen or to not go to the soup kitchen, right? That's not basic. It comes out of as an effect of respect for the law, right? It is the respect that we feel there is an effect of duty and the law and our will working together. Okay, so that's the footnote on respect. And then that was just the categorical imperative. So there we go. Again, universality being the only other feature of the concept of duty from a pure abstract perspective without any regard for the details of any particular situation. That's how we get to the categorical imperative. And Kant is saying that it is within common sense to accept this as true, to accept that I ought never to act in such a way that I couldn't also will that the maxim on which I should act should be a universal law. So he gives an example. Consider the question, may I, when in difficulties, make a promise that I intend not to keep? The question obviously has two meanings. Is it prudent to make a false promise? Or does it conform to duty to make a false promise? Right? So this is what, we can mean two things, right? It would say, like, can I, if I'm in trouble, can I lie to get out of a tough situation, right? We can interpret this question in two ways, right? Is it prudent to do so? And does it conform to duty to make a false promise? No doubt it often is prudent, but not as often as you might think. Obviously, the false promise isn't made prudently by its merely extricating me from my present difficulties. I have to think about whether it will in the long run cause more trouble than it saves in the present. Even with all my supposed cunning, the consequences can't be so easily foreseen. People's loss of trust in me might be far more disadvantageous than the trouble I am now trying to avoid. It is hard to tell whether it mightn't be more prudent to act according to a universal maxim, not ever to make a promise that I don't intend to keep. But I quickly come to see that such a maxim is based only on fear of consequences, right? So if I try to get out of a situation by lying, I might have this thought that comes in and says, wait a minute, maybe I can get out of this situation if I lie. But there could be other consequences later on down the road that might have higher costs than, just dealing with the situation truthfully right now, right? And Kant says that sort of consequence, calculus, right? That's not morality, right? That's only based on fear. Right? Being truthful from duty is an entirely different thing from being truthful out of fear of bad consequences. For in the former case, a law is included in the concept of the action. So the right answer to what are you doing would include a mention of that law. Whereas in the latter, I must first look outward to see what results my action might have. If you're thinking, should I lie in this situation? And you're thinking about, what would happen if I lie, you're already not being moral. You're already outside of morality. You're already gone, right? Because the only reason not to lie is because you have a duty not to lie, right? The only reason to be truthful is because it's our duty to be truthful, and that's all you ever really need to think about. You don't need to think about, like, oh, well, if I lie in this case, then maybe this will happen, and, maybe that'll happen. Like, that whole thought process, that's totally different. That's not morality. It's just not morality. Morality is saying, I have a duty to tell the truth in this situation, and I'm going to tell the truth because it's my duty, no matter the consequences. To deviate from the principle of duty is certainly bad, whereas to be unfaithful to my maxim of prudence may be very advantageous to me, though it is certainly safer to abide by it. How can I know whether a deceitful promise is consistent with duty? The shortest way to go about finding out is to ask, or the shortest way to go about finding out is also the surest. It is to ask myself, would I be content for my maxim of getting out of a difficulty through a false promise to hold as a universal law for myself as well as for others? Right? So if I'm trying to figure out if it's okay to lie to get out of a situation, and I can't think about, the consequences, right? Because that's not morality. I have to ask a different question. I have to ask this question. If I lie now to get out of this situation, would it be okay? Would I endorse that as a universal law for myself and for others? Would it be okay if everybody lied to get out of difficult situations? Would that be okay? And if it's okay for everybody to think that way, then I can do it. But if it's not, then I can't. This is the right kind of way to think about morality. This is moral reasoning, right? Thinking about, the effects or the consequences of whether I could get away with it and how long I could get away with it for and who would be hurt and who wouldn't, right? That's not moral thinking. This is moral thinking. Would it be okay if everybody did this, right? This is tantamount to asking, could I say to myself that anyone may make a false promise when he is in a difficulty that he can't get out of in any other way? Immediately I realized that I could will the lie, but not a universal law to lie. For such a law would result in there being no promises at all, because it would be futile to offer stories about my future conduct to people who wouldn't believe me, or if they carelessly did believe me and were taken in by my promise, they would pay me back in my own coin. They would lie to me back, right? Thus my maxim would necessarily destroy itself as soon as it was made a universal law. Right, so if everybody lied to get out of a sticky situation, the law would destroy itself, right? The maxim that everybody can lie to get out of a difficult situation, right? If that was the law, it would destroy itself, according to Kant. Things to say about this, like Mill, for example, thinks that this is actually an implicit appeal to consequentialism, and so this is an implicit appeal to consequences. So Kant is actually appealing to consequences to prove this. He certainly doesn't think that, but we'll see that when we read Utilitarianism by John Stuart Mill, when we get to that, this is something that he's going to pick on. But in the meanwhile, this is just an example of what Kant thinks is the right way to engage in what we might call moral reasoning. So I don't need to be a very penetrating thinker to bring it about that my will is morally good. Inexperienced in how the world goes, unable to prepare for all its contingencies, I need only to ask myself, can you will that your maxim become a universal law? If not, it must be rejected. Not because of any harm it might bring to anyone, but because there couldn't be a system of universal legislation that included it as one of its principles, and that this is the kind of legislation that reason forces me to respect. I don't yet see what it is based on, a question a philosopher may investigate, but at least I understand these two things. One, it is something whose value far outweighs all the value of everything aimed at by my desire, and two, my duty consists in having to act from pure respect for the practical law. Right? So Kant is saying that before we engage in the details of any particular situation, right? No matter how inexperienced we might be, if we are rational and we just wonder, is it ever okay to lie to get out of a sticky situation? All I have to do is do this little exercise, right? Would it be okay if everybody did that? Can I will lying to get out of a sticky situation as a universal moral law and the world still makes sense? The answer is no, I can't do that. And I've just engaged in moral reasoning that's a priori, right? That is abstracted from the details of any particular situation. That's moral reasoning. That's how it's supposed to work, according to Kant. And this, Kant says, is like in common sense, right? So common sense, people can do this sort of test without without any philosophical training. They can do this. Now, why does it work? Right? How does it work? And all the stuff that Kant's been building in the background here. You don't need to know that to know that lying to get out of a sticky situation generally isn't a good idea. And most of us would agree, right? Most of us would agree that lying to get out of a sticky situation is not morally okay. It might be prudentially okay. Maybe you can get away with it. Maybe things would be smoother. But morally, it's not good. And most of us recognize that. Why? Well, this is why, right? Because the way that moral reasoning actually works as the study of the laws, the universal laws that apply to all rational beings as laws of the will, as laws of freedom, that tells us that it's wrong to lie to get out of a sticky situation. Okay. Every other motive must yield to duty because it is the condition of a will that is good in itself, meaning that to act in accordance with duty is what it means for a will to be good. And the value of that surpasses everything, right? And again, this is like, I keep going back to the example of, dragging yourself to the soup kitchen because it's your duty. That's good, right? That is supremely good. That is, when you drag yourself to the soup kitchen, no matter how bad of a day you're having, no matter how much you don't feel like going, then that is where morality happens. And so, in the common sense understanding of morality, we have worked our way through to its principle, like that, and that is the highest principle, right? The categorical imperative, right here, right? This one, right? That is the principle, and we figured that out by some common sense morality. I guess this is common sense, apparently. Admittedly, common sense doesn't have the abstract thought of its principle as something universal, but it always has the principle in view and uses it as the standard for its judgments. So again, Kant is saying that we do this kind of intuitively. We approach morality with the assumption that there is some element of universality in it, that it's supposed to apply to all rational beings, right? If aliens came down and could lie to us, right, we would think it's wrong for them to lie to us. Because if they are rational and they have the capability to tell us the truth, and they withhold it from us and they don't tell us the truth and they lie to us, we would recognize that as, being contrary to reason. And that's why it's morality, right? That's why it would be within the realm of a moral question to determine whether aliens lying to us would be morally right or wrong. And he's saying that, we all intuitively grasp this, even without doing all the philosophy. Kant is just bringing it to the surface. It would be easy to show how common sense, with this compass in its hand, knows very well how to distinguish good from bad, consistent with duty from inconsistent with duty. To do this, it doesn't have to be taught anything new. It merely needs, in Socratic fashion, to have its attention drawn to the principle that it already has. And thus we can see that neither science nor philosophy is needed in order to know what one must do to be honest and good, and even to be wise and virtuous. That's something we might well have assumed in advance, that the knowledge of what every person is obliged to do, and thus also what everyone is obliged to know, is everyone's business, even the most common person's. Right? So he's saying that even though the all the work that we've done so far in getting to this concept or getting to the categorical imperative is super abstract and obscure and difficult and serious, pure philosophy, everybody kind of acts roughly in accordance with understanding the way that morality works. We all assume that morality is supposed to be universal, that morality has a claim on all of us, that morality demands that we all act in a certain way, that we expect people to act in a certain way by virtue of being rational, by virtue of having the faculty of reason. And most of us kind of agree on the things that are good to do and the things that are bad to do, like, theft, murder, lying, stealing, cheating, right? We all agree that those are bad things. And Kant is just trying to give an explanation of how that is possible. And he is confident that the categorical imperative, right, this, which is a feature of morality itself, of the basic concepts of morality, of duty, of obligation, of the feeling of respect, of the law, of the will, of laws of freedom, right, that gets distilled into this universality principle of the categorical imperative. He's convinced that all that is just buried in common sense somewhere. We can't help admiring the way common sense's ability to make practical judgment outstrips its ability to make theoretical ones. So again, this is going back to what he said before about in the preface, that it was much more urgent that he write the Critique of Pure Reason than that he write the Critique of Practical Reason, because when it comes to ethics and morality, people are much more reliable. But when it comes to science and metaphysics, people are much less reliable, so he has to deal with that first. I don't know if I agree with that, but he's convinced that, like, our basic moral sensibilities and agreements are pretty good as far as it goes. But he wants to go and look under the hood and get at like the structure, the pure way that morality works, abstracted away from all the particulars of a situation. In theoretical judgments, if common sense ventures to go beyond the laws of experience and perceptions of the senses, it falls into sheer inconceivabilities and self-contradictions, or at least into a chaos of uncertainty, obscurity, and instability. And again, if you want to learn about all this, you go read the Critique of Pure Reason. On the other hand, it is just when common sense excludes everything empirical, that is, all action drivers that bring in the senses, that its ability to make practical judgments first shows its advantage. Right? So when he's saying, when we sort of naturally make moral decisions that ignore how we're feeling about a situation, saying, I really don't want to go pick up my kid from school today, but like, I really should, so I'm going to ignore how I'm feeling and go do it anyway. That is like practical reasoning at work. That is like the miracle of human reason at work. The fact that we can overpower our instincts with something that's just like much more noble and pure and worthy and intrinsically good, and indeed is the only thing that is intrinsically good according to Kant. That's practical reason at work. It may then start splitting hairs, quibbling with its own conscience or with other claims concerning what it should be called right, or wanting to satisfy itself about the exact worth of certain actions. And the great thing about these activities of common sense is that in them it has a good chance of getting it right, as any philosopher has. Perhaps a better chance, because the philosopher doesn't have any principle that common sense lacks, and his judgment is easily confused by a mass of irrelevant considerations so that it could easily go astray. Right? So he's, I think, casting shade on like the philosophers who, again, confuse empirical and pure philosophy, right? But who study moral stuff anyway. He's saying that common sense actually gets us pretty far in morality. But here are two ways in which we could interrelate common sense morality and philosophy. We could go along with common sense moral judgments, and bring philosophy, if at all, only so as to make a system of morals more complete and comprehensible, and its rules more convenient for use, especially in disputation. Right? So maybe we agree that, common sense gets us morality most of the way, and we could just bring in some philosophy as needed. Right? Maybe, if we need to, if we have a moral dispute, if we have a disagreement, like, I'm really sick today. If I go to the soup kitchen, I might hurt myself, and go against my duty to preserve my own life and health. But at the same time, if I don't go in, then I go against my duty to be where I said I was going to be. I break a promise, right? And that conflict, common sense, I'm not sure how to deal with it. Let's bring in philosophy to help us settle it. Maybe that's the way that philosophy can help with moral thinking. Or the other possibility, we could steer common sense away from its fortunate simplicity in practical matters and lead it through philosophy into a new path of inquiry and instruction. From what I have said, isn't it clear that one is the wiser option to take? Spoiler alert, no it's not, but Kant's going to explain why. Innocence is indeed a glorious thing, But it is very sad that it doesn't take care of itself and is easily led astray. For this reason, even wisdom, which consists in doing and allowing more than in knowing, needs science, not as something to learn from, but as something that will ensure that wisdom's precepts get into the mind and stay there. Right? So we're saying that wisdom needs science. Right? You can't just be, super wise only through practical knowledge. Right? You need science to give structure to your wisdom, according to Kant. Without that help, they, meaning the precepts of a wise person, are not likely to stay there, and here is why. Against all commands of duty that a man's reason presents to him as deserving of so much respect, he feels in himself a powerful counterweight, namely his needs and preferences, the complete satisfaction of which he lumps together as happiness. Reason issues inexorable commands without promising the preference of anything by way of recompense. It ignores and has no respect for claims that desire makes, claims that are so impetuous and yet so plausible, and which refuse to give way to any command. This gives rise to a natural dialectic, an intellectual conflict or a contradiction, in the form of a propensity to argue against the stern laws of duty and their validity, or at least to cast doubt on their purity and strictness, and, where possible, to make them more accordant with our wishes and desires. This undermines the very foundations of duty's laws and destroys their dignity, which is something that even ordinary practical reason can't, when it gets right down to it, call good. So it's saying that, common sense, even though it gets things right most of the time, it conflicts with duty too often, and it's confused with duty too often to let us completely rely on it. Meaning that we really need to identify duty and morality in this philosophical sense to begin with, and then train ourselves to act in accordance with it. Train ourselves to align common sense, or to figure out why it is that common sense aligns with duty as often as it does. Because otherwise, we're going to start pitting duty against common sense. And when common sense starts fighting with moral duties, you get a big conflict, and you get a mess. Basically, you get a mess. Okay. In this way, common sense is driven to go outside its own territory and to take a step into the field of practical philosophy, right? So when I say, I don't want to go to the soup kitchen today, I really don't feel like it, but it was my duty to do so. Is there any way out of this? And I start thinking I really don't feel like it, and Joe said that he could cover for me if I didn't go in today, and I'm feeling kind of sick, and I could take my dog for a longer walk, so I could do something that's more worthwhile if I don't show up. I could go and help somebody else. I could do something that I feel like doing, and I would probably do that better than going to the soup kitchen and being miserable all day. And then common sense starts defending itself and getting a little wily, and cunning starts to step in. And in this case, that is common sense going outside of its territory and trying to be practical philosophy. And Kant says that cannot happen. That is no good, right? When you mistake common sense for philosophy, that's when you run into trouble. Now, it doesn't need to do this because of any speculative need to build a theory, right? Which is something that never occurs to it as long as it is satisfied to remain merely healthy reason. Rather, it is driven to philosophy in order to become informed and clearly directed regarding the source of its principle and know exactly how it differs from the maxims based on needs and preferences. Right? So again, this conflict between, I feel a duty, but I don't want to do the thing. How do these go together? Kant says we need philosophy to show us the way. It does this so as to escape from the embarrassment of opposing claims and to avoid risking the loss of all genuine moral principles through the ambiguity in which common sense is so easily involved, the ambiguity between the moral and the prudential readings of questions about what one ought to do. Right? So when, I'm not sure if I should do something, I confuse the question of, what is my moral duty to do in this case versus the prudential question of can I get away with it, or will this lead to the best consequences, or something that's not a moral question. And Kant says that because common sense is very bad at distinguishing between these two things and can't make sense of moral duty without the help of philosophy, we need philosophy to do this for us. Thus, when common sense moral thought develops itself, a dialectic surreptitiously occurs, meaning a contradiction, surreptitiously occurs that forces it to look to philosophy for help. And the very same thing happens in common sense theoretical thinking. It is true of each kind of ordinary or common sense thought. Each can come to rest only in a complete critical examination of our reason, meaning the faculty of reason. And that is chapter 1. Okay. So that's it. That is the preface and chapter 1 of Kant's Groundwork for the Metaphysics of Morals. A mere 12 pages, the longest 12 pages like ever. I'm sorry, 13 pages. 13 pages. What a slog. Okay, but also super insightful and super interesting. I'm not a Kantian per se, but I certainly like what he's doing. I think there's a lot of value in this sort of insistence that morality is something pure and, it's overwhelming, because there is a foundation for this in common sense. And I think he does a pretty good job at showing this, that no, there is something really special going on when we say that something is morally good. When we claim that someone is morally good, there's something uniquely rational about that process. And this is his attempt at identifying it. Okay, so we've moved from common sense philosophy, from common sense morality, he thinks, from things that everybody would agree on. This is moral, this is not, this is duty, this is not, right, with all the various examples. We've arrived at the categorical imperative, and in chapter 2, we're going to move from this conception of moral philosophy, categorical imperative, to a metaphysics of morals, right? So we're gonna do the next level of abstract work on what it means to have the concept of duty, and to identify the rules, the categories, the metaphysics of morality on the basis of this concept of duty as understood through the categorical imperative. Chapter 2 is longer, so that video will not be for the faint of heart either. But if you're interested in following along, then do subscribe, because we will get to it in the next couple of weeks. And that's it. I hope you enjoyed the video. I hope you learned some stuff. And yeah, I'll see you in the next one.